Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're embarking on a deep dive. We're looking into one of the most, well, revered and transformative works of mystical poetry ever written, Jalal al-Din Rumi's The Masnavi. And we're specifically focusing on book one today. Our mission, really, it's to extract the most important nuggets of knowledge and insight from this, incredibly rich source material. We'll be highlighting its poetic passages, its powerful symbols and metaphors, and the spiritual lessons it offers. And most importantly, we'll explore how Rumi's ancient wisdom connects directly to personal insight and life application for you, our listener, right here and now. This deep dive, just so you know, is based on a really celebrated translation of Rumi's Masnavi, Book 1, by Jawid Mojaddedi. Now, before we plunge right into the poetry itself, let's maybe quickly set the stage with Rumi, the man behind this masterpiece. Born in 1207, Rumi's family eventually settled permanently in Konya in central Anatolia amidst all the historical shifts happening at the time. He was initially introduced to Sufism through his father, Bahavalad, who was a popular preacher and teacher himself.
Right. But the pivotal moment in Rumi's life, the event that really profoundly reshaped his path, didn't actually happen until 1244. That's when he met a mysterious wandering Sufi known simply as Shamsuddin of Tabriz, or just Shams. And Shams taught Rumi the, quote, most profound levels of Sufism, basically transforming him from this pious religious scholar into an ecstatic mystic. Rumi's devotion to Shams was just absolute. He saw him as the most complete manifestation of God, and he poured this devotion into thousands of lyrical poems. Unconventionally, he even named his entire collection the Collection of Shams. That's how central Shams was. But this intense bond, well, it stirred up considerable jealousy among Rumi's disciples.
Oh, okay. Trouble in paradise, so to speak.
Exactly. It led to Shams being driven away. He did return briefly, but then he disappeared forever. Tradition suggests he was killed, though there isn't much hard evidence.
It's truly fascinating, isn't it, how Rumi's spiritual transformation after Shams's final disappearance led to the iconic whirling dervishes. He apparently began falling into ecstatic trances and, quite famously, spinning around in public, which is why his disciples, who formed the Mevlevi Sufi order after his death, are better known today as the whirling dervishes. His legacy is just immense. His death in 1273 is still commemorated every year in Konya. It attracts pilgrims from, well, all corners of the globe and every religion. That really shows the universal appeal of his message. It's pretty astonishing to think that a 13th century Persian mystic like Rumi was identified as the most published poet in America by 1997.
Yeah, it really is. So, let's move from the man to his masterpiece then, the Masnavi itself. It is widely considered the greatest mystical poem ever written in the vast body of Persian Sufi writing. So revered, in fact, it's commonly called the Qur'an in Persian. Rumi used the Masnavi form, that's a poem in rhyming couplets, to compose this epic work. And it's just monumental. 6 books, tens of thousands of verses. This structure allowed Rumi to weave together this epic tapestry of spiritual teachings. This wasn't just, poetry for poetry's sake. It was Rumi's deliberate way of presenting the fruit of his Sufi experience. He was striving to convey his profound mystical teachings as clearly and effectively as possible.
And the creation process for this epic work was really unique too, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Rumi actually recited it orally whenever inspiration struck him, and his devoted deputy, Hosamuddin Chalabi, he served as his scribe, recording, revising, editing the poem.
Wow. So Hosamuddin was crucial.
So vital that Rumi sometimes even referred to the Masnavi as the Hosam book.
Yeah.
Work on it began around 1262.
That collaborative process, it really speaks volumes. And speaking of structure, unlike some other long poems that have a really rigid frame narrative, the Masnavi feels more like a flowing, almost organic collection. Narratives, homilies, commentaries. He draws from such a vast range of sources, the Quran, the Prophet's traditions, the wisdom of earlier Sufi mystics. Rumi's storytelling is incredibly diverse, too. He uses characters from prophets to animals, he incorporates humor, even jokes about, well, sexuality and stereotypes sometimes. Always with the main aim of making his points as memorable as possible. He wasn't afraid to use any tool, it seems, to shake us into insight. It's a text that definitely prioritizes teaching over strict narrative continuity. He often breaks off stories mid-flow just to explain or illustrate a point, which creates this wonderfully multi-layered and dynamic reading experience, I think.
Yeah, definitely. So let's dive into some of these key lessons from Book 1, starting right at the very beginning with the Song of the Reed. That's the first 18 verses of the prologue. Rumi opens really innovatively with a direct address to the reader. Listen. The central image is the reed, you see, cut from the reed bed. And now, as a flute, it mourns its separation. For Rumi, this is just a profound symbol for the mystic's deep sense of separation from their origin with God and that intense yearning to
The
return.
feeling of longing, yeah.
Exactly. It's a core human experience. Love, as he states later, is the force that intensifies this yearning. It removes the veils caused by our attachment to, worldly things. The ultimate goal, then, is that through divine love, the lover is effaced, wiped out, in a sense, and only God, the beloved, lives on. This teaches that humans must recognize their own fundamental non-existence, maybe, and strive to become effaced in God, to truly exist through him.
So, what does this all mean for you listening right now? It seems Rumi is teaching us that the ache of longing isn't some kind of weakness. It's actually our soul's internal compass, constantly pointing us back to our true origin. The insight here, that feeling of something missing, isn't really emptiness, but an active, divine pull guiding you toward a deeper connection. Okay, so if the read teaches us about separation, Rumi then shows us how our own ego, our I, can be the biggest barrier to connection. There's this fascinating story about the man who learned to knock on his beloved's door and say, "It is you."
The tale itself is simple.
Oh.
A lover is turned away for saying, "It is I,"
Yeah.
at the door.
Right.
And he's only admitted after being, as Rumi puts it, cooked by separation's flame and returning to say, "It is you."
Yeah, and this really makes us consider what's the deeper teaching here about ego and union. Rumi uses it to beautifully illustrate this concept of effacement in God. That's all about letting go of the illusion of our individual self, that it is I identity.
That separate self, exactly, to achieve a true union with the divine. Think of it like a single drop of water merging into the vast ocean. It doesn't disappear, exactly, but its separate identity dissolves into something far greater. And this story is strategically placed among other narratives that reinforce this idea, like the fox who learns to think only for his king, or Joseph's visitor presenting a mirror as the best possible gift.
That mention of the mirror in Joseph's story is key, isn't it? Because Rumi frequently uses the mirror as this powerful metaphor for the soul itself and its journey.
Precisely. Yeah. He describes the soul as being tarnished by the, quote, rust of attachment to phenomenal existence, which is basically all the worldly desires, the ego, the distractions that cloud our inner vision.
All that noise.
Right. The cleansing process then involves scraping away this rust by breaking those attachments. This often requires rigorous discipline, and frequently under the direct guidance of a Sufi master. Once that mirror becomes completely clear, it becomes receptive to the pure light of God. It contains nothing but his reflection. It achieves clarity, purity, and ultimately union.
Rumi's mirror, it gives us such a powerful daily practice, really. Our soul's clarity depends on consciously identifying and, well, wiping away the rust of our attachments. The insight here is that self-reflection isn't passive. It's a rigorous, ongoing cleaning of our internal lens. It takes work. And speaking of love, the very first story in the Masnavi does a beautiful job differentiating between the kinds of love Rumi's really talking about and the love we often think of. It's the story called The Healing of the Sick Slave Girl. In it, a devout king's slave girl is sick, and she's miraculously cured by a divine healer. The healer discovers she's actually lovesick, and he reunites her with her sweetheart. But then, in a shockingly radical move, he slowly poisons the husband, so she actually watches him rot and lose his good looks over time. It's quite graphic.
It is graphic. And a remarkable aspect here is how Rumi uses this seemingly harsh lesson to clarify his profound distinction between different kinds of love. He makes it crystal clear that the annihilating force of love discussed in the prologue, the love that leads to effacement and union with God, is divine love. And this is starkly contrasted with fickle, superficial human love, which is often based on, external appearances or transient desires.
Just that fade.
Exactly. It's a stark reminder that true spiritual transformation, the kind that leads to deeper insight and union, well, it can be radical. It can be demanding. It's not always comfortable. And finally, we really must discuss the overriding importance of the Sufi master in Rumi's understanding of Sufism. The master figure is absolutely central to everything. He appears as a character in many major narratives in Book 1, like that divine healer we just discussed. And his role is discussed extensively throughout the book in the homilies and commentaries. Rumi urges the reader, urges you, to choose a Sufi master as a guide and to follow them wholeheartedly and unconditionally. He also includes sections on imposters, false Sufi masters.
Right, the warnings.
Which only underlines further the immense importance he places on finding a genuine mediator or guide. You need the real thing. And, of course, this emphasis profoundly reflects Rumi's own transformative devotion to Shamsi Tabriz, his own spiritual master.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And this raises an important question for us, even today, right? While maybe not all of us are seeking a Sufi master in the traditional sense, What does this profound emphasis on guidance mean for our own journeys? Our journeys of learning and personal insight. I think it highlights the enduring value of mentorship, of finding wise guides, teachers, maybe even good therapists or coaches. And also the importance of cultivating discernment in who we allow to influence our paths towards understanding and growth. It's really about recognizing that some journeys are just best walked with experienced companionship. So today, we've really only scratched the surface of the Masnavi. It's such a truly profound work that just continues to resonate across centuries and cultures, speaking to the deepest parts of the human experience. Through this vivid poetry and these compelling stories, Rumi offers us a powerful path to understanding the human condition, the nature of divine love, that journey of effacement, and the crucial importance of spiritual guidance.
Indeed. This Masnavi, as the prose introduction itself states, is truly, let me get the quote right, a cure for breasts, the purge of sorrows, the Qur'an's unveiler, and a vast profusion of man's sustenance and purest qualities. It's really an invitation, isn't it, to consider life's deepest truths not just as, abstract concepts, but as living realities that shape our very existence.
So, as you reflect on Rumi's wisdom and these insights we've talked about, maybe consider this for yourself. What rust of attachment to phenomenal existence might you need to identify and perhaps begin to scrape away to clarify your own mirror of the soul? And in your own pursuits of understanding and connection, whatever they may be, what might it mean for you to genuinely say, it is you, rather than clinging so tightly to it is I? It's a powerful distinction to think about, isn't it? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into Rumi's Masnavi. We really hope it provided you with some memorable insights and maybe a few moments of discovery. We're so glad you're part of our last-minute lecture family. Until next time, keep diving deep.